Hello and welcome to History Bite, and today we're going to be talking about the Treaty of Versailles, the document signed after the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 that brought an end to World War I and dealt with the punishments to be handed out to Germany. At the 11th hour of the 11th day in November 1918, Germany signed the armistice which brought an end to the fighting in World War I. The victorious powers met at Versailles in January 1919 for the Paris Peace Conference, but Germany had not been invited. After having endured 4 years of intense fighting, the Allies now had long demands for the future of Europe. The French had endured the brunt of the fighting for 4 years, mostly on their homeland, and had received millions of casualties. Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau was consumed with a need for vengeance, and coupled with this, an intention to crush Germany so as to deny it an opportunity to ever threaten France again. On the other side, the Americans had not seen much fighting at home, and had sustained far less casualties having joined the war in 1917. Woodrow Wilson had set out an equitable deal in his 14 points, and the Germans hoped this would form the basis of the peace agreements. But right in the middle between the brutal intentions of Clemenceau and the more lenient ideas of Woodrow Wilson was David Lloyd George. He understood the need to punish Germany and indeed wanted to ensure the British Empire and their naval supremacy was not challenged in future. However, Lloyd George was more realistic in realising that leniency would allow the German economy to get back on its feet and trade with Britain could recommence. However, as the Paris Peace Conference went on, it was pretty clear that all the objectives of the big three leaders of America, Britain and France were not completely going to be met. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles were announced on the 7th of May 1919 and sent a huge wavelength through Europe, no less in Germany, who viewed the final provisions with shock, disgust and in many cases hatred. So now we're going to look at what the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles actually were. But in order to do that, we need to look at the acronyms. There have been some great ones over the years, including LAM and GARGLE. But at History Bite, we're going to be looking at the 6 key provisions using the acronym BLAMED. BLAMED stands for Blame, Land, Army, Money, Empire and Disputes. So we're going to look at these points one at a time. Firstly, it's important to start with B for blame. Under Article 231 of the treaty, Germany was forced to accept the blame for starting the war. This was unpopular and became known as the War Guilt Clause. Another clause in the Treaty of Versailles stipulated that Germany was to face a reduction in German land, which in the end turned out to be around 10%. The large Rhineland area in the west of Germany was to be demilitarised, meaning that no German troops could be stationed there. The Saarland, a hugely industrialised area, was to be run by the League of Nations for 15 years before a vote would be taken as to whether this would then return to Germany. The beautiful and culturally significant region of Alsace-Lorraine was awarded to France. The Germans had won this from the French in the war between them in 1871, and now the French had won this back. To the north, the area of North Schleswig was awarded to Denmark. To the west, the vast area of West Prussia and Posen were given to Poland. This strip of land became known as the Polish Corridor because it gave the Poles access to the North Sea. It had the consequence of isolating East Prussia from the rest of German land. As well as that, the city of Danzig was given to the League of Nations to run as a free city. Finally, any unification or Anschluss between Austria and Germany, who had been allied during the war and shared a similar language and culture, was now prohibited. Another condition of the Treaty of Versailles was to try and reduce the threat that Germany might pose in future, and so the armed forces of Germany were heavily restricted. The German army was limited to 100,000 men, and conscription was banned, meaning that all soldiers had to be volunteers. Germany was not allowed to possess any tanks, any military aircraft, or any submarines. Germany's navy was also restricted to 6 battleships and 6 cruisers. Moving on to money, the war in Europe had cost Europeans heavily, and Germany was to be made to pay reparations to cover these costs to pay for the damage caused by the war. The amount to pay came to £6.6 billion, a sum so enormous that even the Allied economists predicted that it would be impossible for Germany to pay. We mustn't forget that Germany also had to rebuild its own infrastructure and economy after the war, just like the other nations, except this time they were also footing the bill for the other nations too. This would be something that would prove to be crippling to Germany. Another provision of the Treaty of Versailles concerned Germany's empire. Although Germany had already lost 10% of its land in Europe, the Allies had not finished there. Britain and France also took control of all Germany's overseas territories. This included the land in Africa and land in Asia as well, much of which passed to the Japanese, who had been allies of Britain during the war. The final area of the acronym blamed deals with disputes, and a new measure of dispute resolution had been established in the form of the League of Nations. This would be an international arbitration system to help nations discuss their problems without the need to go to war again. It had been a key provision in Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. However, under the terms of the treaty, Germany was not allowed to join the League until it had proved itself peaceful. So those were the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. But what were the major consequences of this treaty on Germany? One of the first things to note is that the treaty did not completely satisfy Britain, France or the USA because no leader could get exactly what they'd originally intended for their country. They all came to deeply regret it. The treaty plunged Germany into an unbelievable strife. The people couldn't believe they'd been dealt so harshly, and hatred towards the Allies started to grow. And you can hardly blame Germany for being mad. They'd just lost 10% of all their land, all of their overseas colonies, 12.5% of their population, 16% of their coal industry and 48% of their iron industry. Millions of demoralized people began to blame the new Weimar Republic, which had been created in Germany upon the abdication of the Kaiser. They saw this new government as betrayers, people who had agreed this horrible peace. The stab in the back myth began to grow in popularity. In the next decade, Germany would suffer armed rebellion, attempted coups, and almost economic ruin. Many historians now recognise that the harsh terms of the treaty played an important role in anti-British and French feeling, which allowed extremist parties like the Nazis to later stir up support in the 1930s. Indeed, many historians attribute it to being one of the major reasons for the outbreak of the Second World War, because Adolf Hitler, amongst his other actions, had tried to recover the land that had been lost under the terms of the treaty. Indeed, it was French Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch that said this isn't a peace, it's just an armistice for 20 years. And he would be correct, because within the next 2 decades, Europe was plunged into an even greater war, which would change the world forever. If you enjoyed this video and would like to find out more about history, why not subscribe to our channel or follow us on Twitter or Facebook?